Western music. Over the generations, it's been used to signify impending drama. It's been parodied endlessly. It's even been made into a disco tune. It has, a bit of Beethoven. As familiar as these opening bars are to just about everyone, and as well known as the whole symphony is to many, it's helpful to understand why. What makes this piece so important to the course of music history? The answer goes well beyond these opening bars that we just played, but ultimately it can be reduced almost entirely to those opening bars. Tonight's guided tour will explain why and how Beethoven's Fifth Symphony is a groundbreaking work, one that would ripple through the entire 19th century and beyond. I've been teaching full-time at Nassau Community College, which is just down the road from here, for 18 years. And one of the courses that I frequently teach is a class in music appreciation. And my favorite day of the semester is always teaching this piece. And I take the class, the entire piece from beginning to end, over 75 minutes, and I'm not going to do that to you. They'll kill me. So we're not going to have a whole lesson tonight, but we're going to give you enough insight to have a deeper understanding and hopefully an enhanced listening experience. So what's this piece all about? There's no concrete story being told, but there's definitely a narrative. There's a conflict and there's accompanying drama. The narrative comes from this pervasive musical idea. It's so short and so lacking in melodic shape that we can't even call it a theme. The conflict comes from a battle over what key should dominate the piece. And the drama stems from a series of compositional moves so bold that the very notion of what a symphony is would change forever and would lead the great composer Brahms to say of Beethoven some 40 years after Beethoven had died, "You don't know what it means to the likes of us to hear his footsteps behind us." So, back to that famous opening. What about it would have made its first audience in 1808 open their ears a little bit, raise their eyebrows? For starters, the music can't seem to get going. It starts and then pauses on a long note, then it's restated on lower notes, and then it pauses again. After those two pauses, things seem to get going, but not for long. Let's talk about that musical idea for a moment. As I said before, it's hard to call it a theme. Themes tend to be melodic and have some kind of shape and direction. This has none of those elements. This is really just a rhythm made up of 3 short notes followed by a long note, which is repeated on a series of different pitches and played by different instruments of the orchestra. In music, we refer to this kind of idea as a motive. And as we're about to hear, this motive is going to appear and keep appearing throughout the movement. Now, the thing about motives is that they're supposed to be like seedlings. Composers plant them in our ears at the beginning of a piece, and they germinate into bigger, more extensive ideas. But this motive doesn't evolve into anything else, and it doesn't seem to generate any new or expanded material. What it does is replicate and spread throughout the orchestra, making multiple copies of itself, like a viral element. Even when we come to a section where we finally do get to a contrasting idea, as you're about to hear in the woodwinds, that motive keeps tapping us on the shoulder, thanks to the cellos and basses. So throughout the movement, although there's lots of excitement, through rhythmic activity and changes of dynamics, essentially nothing happens, other than Beethoven kind of beating us over the ears with this motive. However, even though there's no thematic development taking place, there is some harmonic intrigue. As the movement gets to a place where it should be winding down to a close, we find ourselves in kind of a strange place. This symphony, you see, is advertised as being in the key of C minor. That means that most of the movements, and especially the first movement, should begin and end in that key, even if it ventures off to some other places in the middle. This is actually one of the basic expectations of music from this era. A piece in C minor should at the very least begin and end in that key. And there's more to it than that. See, keys were chosen by composers for important reasons. Each key sounded unique, had its own flavor, its own quirks, to the point that they were given characters, which they called affects. C minor had a reputation for being gloomy, for instance. Beethoven had earlier published a piano sonata in that same key that he called the Pathétique. Here in the Fifth Symphony, we might translate gloomy to stormy. And that's where this closing material starts to become important. This is not C minor. This is C major, which is an entirely different affect. It was thought of as pure and rejoicing. Now, Beethoven is going to right the ship and finish off the movement in the proper key through a series of maneuvers, but now we've got two of our elements, the narrative in the form of the motive, and we have the conflict, which is a conflict of keys. So all we need now is the drama that ties this whole story together, and that's where we have to move on to the following movements. The second movement starts with one of Beethoven's best written melodies, played by the violas and cellos in the key of A flat major. Over the course of the movement, this melody will receive a number of rhythmic variations that get ever more ornate with each variation. It's always followed by a second theme, and those two parts are always connected by this melody, first in the woodwinds, then repeated by the strings. And listen carefully to the rhythm. Rhythm, short, 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 long. Beethoven is sending us a subtle, almost subliminal message that the motive is not limited to just the first movement. Now, the second half of the melody keeps repeating that rhythmic idea until a sudden explosion of sound as the trumpets, horns, and timpani proclaim the motive at full volume. It's C major. So that's back to more assertive and triumphant than before, almost like a military procession. So two essential ideas from the first movement have found their way into the second as well. And this back and forth between the first melody and its variations, connected by that motive to the proclamations of C major, will continue throughout the movement. And to further link back to the first movement, in the middle of one of our variations, Beethoven will give us a sudden stoppage of time, just as he did frequently in the first movement. Now, you might ask why these things matter so much. Why take note of them? And it's because at this moment, Beethoven changes the ground rules for the symphony. Prior to this time, the symphony was considered a single composition in name only. In reality, its four movements were really just a set of discrete compositions. With the connections here in the fifth, however, Beethoven is hinting at something greater, the symphony as a singular work of art. So what's he going to do for the third movement? He's going back to C minor, and notice how this section sounds brooding and tumultuous. And once again, within a few bars, he brings time to a standstill, tries again, and comes to another halt, just like he did in the first movement. That suspension of time, we get this. Where the second movement was subtle and understated in its presentation of the motive, this is brash and in your face. There's no doubt about what Beethoven is doing here. It's entirely self-referential. When we get to the middle portion of the movement, known as the trio, Beethoven uses this technique called imitation. The basses and cellos start the idea, which then gets repeated by the violas and bassoons, then the second violins join in, and then the firsts and the rest of the orchestra. And once again, we're going to find ourselves in the key of C major. This is the third straight movement in which Beethoven uses this key for a major event within the work. Notice the brightness of tone and the joy evident in this section. Let's focus for a moment on the way this big phrase ends. There it is again. The motive, short, 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 long, in yet another guise. Beethoven apparently has endless ways to incorporate this idea, both direct and indirect. It's one of those things that an audience might not notice consciously, but once you know it's there, you can't not hear it. We're going to hear several repeats of this imitative figure before the volume drops, and we find ourselves back to the original material, once again in C minor, complete with its fits of starting and stopping. Beethoven sets us up for a quiet, succinct end to the movement, but he gives us something quite out of the blue instead. We expected to hear an ending in C minor, but he instead deceives us by continuing with an A flat major chord, which you all knew, of course. And we now find ourselves in a bit of a no man's land. The only guide we have here is the timpani. First playing the motive, then just on the beat, then a pulsation, kind of like a heartbeat, a lifeline, if you will, before it starts a constant thrumming. It sounds like this. With the strings holding the chord during this, we get another sense of time being suspended, until the first violins start a little melody. This kicks off a series of chord changes that takes our ears on a very strange, meandering journey until we get here. And with that, we've made a segue into the final movement. No break, no pause, just a flow from one to the other. Now remember I mentioned previously that symphonies had always been a set of discrete compositions. Beethoven, on the other hand, is making it 100% clear that this is about the big picture, the piece as a whole. So, now we've reached a sense of unity through multiple incorporations of the motive, through the appearance of C major at important points in each of the first three movements, and now from this seamless flow from the third movement into the finale. And of course, Beethoven isn't done. Here's where he brings it all together. I promise we're almost done. The declaration that begins this final movement is a triumphant one. So triumphant, in fact, that Beethoven can't make his point without adding more instruments, a piccolo and 3 trombones. And this marks the first time that either one of these groups of instruments has been used in a symphony. Not only that, the movement is in C major. Now it is ascendant, it's in charge, and it is glorious, representing victory, brightness over gloom. And yet, despite all of that, the motive still has work to do. It sneaks its way in via the cellos and basses during a transition between themes. Mere seconds later, the motive becomes the main rhythmic component of the second theme. Once this entire entire portion of the movement repeats, we go into development. And which theme does Beethoven choose to develop? The one with the motive, of course. It swirls around the orchestra, from the strings to the woodwinds and back again. We get to full volume, and then suddenly we get this. To the audience in 1808, this moment must have been mind-blowing. Not only has he connected the third and fourth movements going forwards, but now he's going backwards, back to C minor, back to the prior movement. In doing this, Beethoven shakes the very core of symphonic writing. Never again could a composer put the title symphony on a composition without confronting the vast scope of work that would be expected from them. We see this reflected in the number of symphonies that composers write, including Beethoven, after this point. Many 18th century composers wrote symphonies by the dozen. By comparison, Mozart wrote 41 in his very short life, and Haydn wrote at least 104 of them. After including Beethoven, most composers only create symphonies in single digits, but each work is on a much more massive scale than any earlier composer would have envisioned. This interlude is brief, and the same chords that set up the beginning of this movement return and take us to the recapitulation, or the representation of the material we've heard already, and we stay entirely within C major. Now, the coda, the ending section, is set up with short chords at the beginning of each measure before we hear part of the main theme in the bassoons and then the horns. When the strings join in, we hear rising scales in the piccolo, and then we hear this entire sequence again. From there, the tempo gradually increases until we find ourselves in the final moments of the symphony with just the strings playing this. We'll play it one more time. Pay attention to the basses and cellos. That's the last hurrah of the motive. From this point forward, this triumphant theme that began the movement owns the day, as does C major, with the last 40 plus bars of music being nothing more than a restatement of a bunch of C major chords. At last, this conflict is resolved, the drama high, the narrative complete, just like this guided tour. Without further ado, we present in its entirety Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Happy listening.